Welcome to this session on information literacy. I am Freya Hendrikman, a faculty liaison librarian of the ISS and Erasmus University Rotterdam. Here is an outline of this session. The definition of information literacy is not static. At its core, information literacy, or IL, is knowing when and why you need information, where to find it, and how to evaluate, use, and communicate it in an ethical manner. Even the most basic definition acknowledges that it is more than just searching, finding, and evaluating information. Now we see that more and more people recognize data as a form of information. The storage, publication, and so on of data has become part of IL. This broad definition of information literacy means that it includes topics such as finding literature and referencing, but also open access publishing, data skills, and much more. Another term that I will use in this session is the information landscape. In this case, I will limit the bounds of the information landscape to only the information used to study. It is important to recognize that everybody's information landscape is different. Students who have come from a different institution might be used to a very different landscape. Even students who are at the same institution have different information landscapes because they differ per field, but also per individual. Next, it is also important to think about how the information landscape has changed over time. Take a moment to think about how it has changed at your institution during the last few years. Or, if you haven't been at your institution for that long, think about how different the landscape is at your current institution compared to the one where you did your studies. Let's delve deeper into the individual differences per student. Not only does the information landscape differ per student, but each student is also unique when it comes to their abilities in information literacy. There is plenty of research on the skill sets of undergraduate level students, but only limited research on graduate level students. The limited research that has been done logically shows that graduate students are expected to have more developed skills than undergraduate students. However, often supervisors and other advisors assume these skills were previously acquired when they were not. There are also a lot of assumptions about the digital skills of students. But using social media for leisure is not the same as using digital tools for research. First, take a moment to think about the information skills required of undergraduate and graduate students, how they differ, and how the development of these skills is currently addressed in your institution. Now take a moment to think of differences between students. Do you have students that have done their undergraduate programs in other institutions? The systems they are used to might be completely different, or they haven't received library instruction before. Perhaps you have students that have returned to study after spending time in the workforce. International students might also have a very different set of skills or face language barriers. International students can also think differently about what it means to critically assess information. It is important to know which skills need more development. Don't base this on your assumptions. You can either assess this as a supervisor by talking to a student about their background and required skills, but you can also have students assess their current level themselves. Only with awareness of the current situation can the supervisor and student think about the way they want to develop these skills. If you want students to assess themselves, you can start with the handout at the bottom of the slides. This gives some milestones in the narrow definition of information literacy up to master's level. You can also look at information skills as part of all skills that are necessary for a researcher in the research development framework, but this might be a bit overwhelming for students. When you have an idea of what your students can and can't do, it's time to put this into the institutional context. Let's highlight two elements. What is the information landscape like? And what is the support like? We have already talked about the information landscape. It is important that a student is fully aware of what information sources your institution has to offer. Since the library is often the keeper of these sources, it makes sense to work closely with the library to inform students about this. Research shows that supervisors are not always aware of the support available for their students, and sometimes find it difficult to identify what training and support is available. Only support for information search and reference management is nearly universally known about. On the other hand, supervisors are often aware of their own shortcomings when it comes to being fully up to date with the latest technologies. It is important to get an overview of the support available to lighten the load you have as a supervisor. Take a look at the list of possible support. If you don't know if such support is available, contact the library or other support staff to make sure you are not missing out on support opportunities. After inventorying the available support at your institution, you might find that it is not sufficient for your students' current needs. Luckily, it's very common in the field of information literacy to share resources for reuse. Especially online courses and guides on specific information skills can be used across countries and research fields. When you are done with the session, click through these websites to see which one would fit your students' needs best. It's better to share one instead of all. You can also search on Google for more resources or ask your library for more online guides and courses. When doing this, you might want to keep internet access in mind. If internet access is limited or unreliable for students, it might be better to share handouts. One of the most popular workshops I provide at ISS is on the basics of searching in online sources. It seems students really want to get a kickstart to their research. As the saying goes, well begun is half done. Here are some of the points I cover in this workshop. Make a search profile. I usually use a handout for this since it makes it easier to share ideas in groups. Students write down their research question and identify the main concepts in that question, and they share this with a peer to see if everything is clear. On a side note, I see that students, even up to the PhD level, really appreciate this peer feedback, especially PhD students, because they often only get feedback from their supervisor and they want to see if everything is clear for other people as well. When they have these key concepts, they identify alternative terms, such as synonyms, translations, or related broader or narrower terms. Then they combine the terms with Boolean operators, such as and, not, and or. All of the terms and the Boolean operators combined is the search profile, and you can use this to find literature in online sources. This seems a bit basic for PhD candidates, but this structured approach is not known to all students and it's very useful. Next, I instruct students to keep record of their searches from the beginning. When did they search? Where did they search? Which terms did they use? Keeping record of this can help avoid doing things double, and it can help with identifying why a student can't find appropriate literature. In the same line, it helps to use a reference manager. There are paid and free options out there, so check if your university or institution already provides support for a certain reference manager. I instruct students to not only save the literature they want to use, but also make a folder called maybe or not use. That way they can quickly check if they have already read an article they find in a new search. Reference managers also make it easier to adapt to reference style requirements of publishers. Next, I show the students the library guides that we have on their field of research. These guides give extra information on how databases differ from each other and which one is the best for their research. On a related note, make sure students understand the difference between Google Scholar and an academic database. You will see a guide on this in the ISS Erasmus University modules I shared with you on the previous slides. If students are planning to collect quantitative or qualitative data, I also mention research data management during this workshop, even though it's really early in their research. Otherwise, students start thinking about saving data after they've already collected it. So you make it part of the routine that they think about how they will safely store their data, but perhaps also share their data sets after they have published an article. It might seem a bit early to do that at the beginning of the research, but it might affect the way they process their data from the start onwards. At the beginning of the session, I mentioned how the definition of information literacy has become broader over recent years. It might now include elements that you would like to know more about. I've made a selection of some relatively recent developments, so let's start with open access. There is a push by many in the academic world for open access publishing, so this basically means that your work is not hidden behind a paywall. The problem that many now face is that the cost of publishing is then moved to the author. You have to pay to publish. Those are called article publishing charges, or APCs. You should check with your institution if anybody keeps track of deals with regards to APCs. Sometimes the APCs are waived or discounted. For example, researchers from EIFL partner countries can get APC discounts from Cambridge, Sage, and even more publishers. Related notes, Kenya is an EIFL partner country. Also, when publishing open access, make sure your students are still critical. There are some who only create open access journals to collect APCs, and they don't provide actual editing or dissemination services. Open access is also part of the open science movement, so it's not only about sharing your final papers or articles, but also your research data, working papers, or perhaps the thoughts you had while doing research in a blog. Finally, open access can also be used as a resource. Think of the directory of open access books or the directory of open access journals, but also the articles and data that others share in online repositories. Next, let's take a look at online profiling of researchers and their work. I would advise PhD candidates to create their ORCID right away. An ORCID ID is a unique ID number that will differentiate them from others with the same name. It is also possible that your name can be spelled differently in different publications. With your ORCID ID, you make clear that it is all written by you. It is useful to make using your ORCID part of your publishing routine. Part of your online presence might also be the use of Twitter. When sharing your work online, either on Twitter or other social media, add the DOY of the article. There are programs that measure the attention academic work gets. If you use the DOY, that is the unique digital identifier of an article, the system can pick up your work more easily. This brings me to impact. Traditional impact measures of research look at how many times something is cited. The library will have more knowledge on the exact ins and outs of this, but it is useful to know that the citations in Google Scholar are often not 100% correct. A newer way of looking at impact is looking at the attention an article gets outside of scientific referencing. Special computer programs look at how many times an article is mentioned in newspapers, on Twitter, on Facebook, or in policy documents. These alternative impact measures are gaining in popularity. Examples are Plum and Altmetric Explorer. Having basic knowledge of these developments is important because they affect the basic routine of a researcher when it comes to dissemination of knowledge. As was noted earlier, data is now also part of information literacy. At some universities, the data team is part of the library. At others, there is a separate support team, and at some, there is no data support at all. If there is no support available, your task as a supervisor becomes bigger. You'll have to give more guidance to your students. A good starting point would be to share an example of a data management plan. These can be easily found on the internet. These plans force the researcher to think of how they will find, use, store, and share data throughout the whole research process. Next, be aware that the issues surrounding data are not restricted to quantitative data. Qualitative data deals with many similar issues. How do I safely store data? How do I make sure sensitive information is stored anonymously? What will I do with the data after I have finished my research? All important questions. As a good example, you might want to check if you have data from previous research that you would like to share publicly. So this leaves us with going over the practical implications. First, you'll have to critically assess what the skill level of your student is. Next, you make a plan of how you are going to address possible shortcomings. Students who are lagging behind the others can benefit from peer support, and your institution might already have more guides and workshops available than you are currently aware of. In any case, the students will appreciate some pointers on where and how to start. This is also a good time to teach them some good research routines when it comes to information skills. Check in once in a while to see if the students have encountered problems when it comes to information literacy. The most difficult thing will probably be to keep up to date on developments. Again, contact the library and support staff for help. They might be able to help you through a monthly newsletter or email alerts, and they might point out useful workshops.